6 of 6 weeks of evidence, and I appreciate your many of you that have stuck with me for most of this, and then in new faces, well, I hope you've been warned. I'm a little tired today. That will become more clear when I get into. There was one thing I just really wanted to wedge it in, and I just couldn't find a way to make it palatable for a general consumption. So we'll see. But yeah, I'm a little groggy today, so maybe a little off on a few things. We'll manage through. Let's begin with the word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for this tremendous opportunity to yet again behold your wonders, your majestic works, the things for which we praise you, and yet we praise you most for your salvation in your Son. And we ask and give you thanks for these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. Well, this is, we got through, I think, 3 evidences last week, so technically we're behind. But I didn't put a bunch of intro slides in this time. We'll jump right in where we left off. Again, this is week 6, 10 top evidences. And again, because I don't think there is top 10, so we'll just do 10 of the top, if that makes any sense. And I swapped these in and out over time, and I still think about swapping things out up to the last minute, but we'll go with this list here. And I'm going to skim on a couple because I've got things I want to say that may not fall into those. But this is going to be the list we have left, 4 through 10. And let's start with 4, which is metamorphosis. These are evidences for creation. Now, recall that there are 2 basic worldviews for how things happen. Either the evolutionary worldview, and there's some key terms in the evolutionary worldview, the undirected process. If we're talking about classic evolution, well, that has a name now called the Neo-Darwinian synthesis. And the reason that name is important, that's basically the accumulation of mutations with natural selection acting on those mutations to create new forms, new phenotypes, new behaviors, all the things you see in nature. Well, that's actually being even abandoned by evolutionists. The ones in the inner circle are negative. It's inadequate for its intended purpose, which would be to create new forms, new features. And so because of that, they're looking for other mechanisms for evolution, but they don't deny for a second that we're here through a natural, materialistic, undirected process. That is the evolutionary side. And the other side of the house would be that God created the world. God created the heavens and the earth and all that is in them. And if you're biblical, he did that in 6 days. That's the most straightforward reading of Genesis. 6 basically 24-hour days. There was evening and there was morning the first day, and there was evening and there was morning the second day, and so forth. Okay, so what this presentation is trying to touch on are evidences that would support one story or the other. And I'm not going to support the evolutionary story. I have a different talk on that. It's called Arguments Against Evolution, or Arguments for Evolution Weighed and Found Wanting. Kind of took it from that passage in Daniel. But this is, the handwriting on the wall, many, technically Larson, where the king, the ruler, freaked out and said for Daniel, Daniel said, yeah, you've been weighed and found wanting. That's how I believe many of the evidences for evolution are. Things like homology and stuff like that. But that's not this talk. This talk is evidences for creation and for the biblical story of creation. And so that's the context of where we are. We're looking at evidence number 4, metamorphosis. Of course, our friendly little furry caterpillar. There's a great movie on this, by the way. I think I may have referenced it either in this week's or last week's notes. This is a monarch caterpillar, which, as most of us know from being in school, it becomes a monarch butterfly. And isn't that a beautiful thing? It starts its life by eating leaves and chewing, a lot of chewing, a lot of eating and growing and getting strong. Then eventually this is what happens. It spins, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but I'm going to try to introduce a few new ideas for you in the details here that I think speak to the handiwork of God. So the monarch cocoon, caterpillar rather, he spins this chrysalis, what we call the cocoon. And that's a beautiful thing, just to have the mechanism to be able to do that. But now what happens inside the cocoon? Well, we know he's going to transform, or she, into a butterfly. That's neat. But let's read a little bit more about that. Inside the chrysalis, much of the body breaks itself down into imaginal cells, which are undifferentiated, like stem cells. They can become any type of cells. The imaginal cells put themselves back together in the new shape. And what is interesting here is eventually they will, there's a lot of complexity, and I'm taking those slides out. But the imaginal cells, the new cells, they consume the old cells for fuel and turn themselves into the butterfly through this step-by-step process. And what I want you to think about is, how could this have evolved? What slow, gradual unfolding of steps would have gotten us to this? How could any creature decompose itself and recompose itself as something entirely different at the cellular level? How could that have come about through any evolutionary process? The best you're left with, and I'm asking evolutionists about this, is must have been an extended larval stage, and they can throw a lot of terms and big words at it, but there's no explanation. There's terms for a lot of things. That doesn't mean they understand it or can explain it in a way that is reasonable. As a human, we should be able to reason together and come up with, does this make sense or not? This, to me, is not achievable to any gradual, step-by-step, undirected evolutionary unfolding in nature. It's just not. It doesn't lend itself to any story that is plausible. So, and by the way, how many things could go wrong? Let's say you did have all the pieces necessary to decompose inside that chrysalis, recompose as an entirely different creature, but wait, how do you get out? You've got to break out of this thing. Well, there's a specific enzyme. An enzyme is like a protein, a specific peptide that cuts the chrysalis. It breaks it down and allows the chrysalis to break open so it can come out. You get everything else right and forget that one enzyme, you're dying inside that chrysalis. So nature is full of this stuff, what we call irreducible complexity. Remove any component of this, and that component, that enzyme, doesn't serve any other purpose in the life cycle of the butterfly other than to break open the chrysalis at the appropriate time, not too early, not too late. And so this kind of stuff is just replete in nature, and I think this is one of the clearer examples of it. So I like the butterfly. By the way, their life cycle, and if you watch the video, I think it's called Metamorphosis. It's remarkable, and I don't remember all the details. There's a tree, or set of trees down in Mexico, and they start their life cycle there, and they grow, and they basically follow the milkweed, and as the milkweed becomes mature in the season, in spring and into summer, they move further and further and further north. They have life cycles like 3, 4, 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks, and then the next caterpillar and the next butterfly, and it just keeps extending as they move further and further and further north, all the way up into Canada, and then sometime in the fall, something happens. Somehow they know they're born without any reproductive organs, and instead of living for 3 to 4 to 6 weeks, 8 weeks, that last generation, and the reason they don't have reproductive organs is everything is now devoted to the long flight home. And so now this generation lives several months. And that last generation, and it doesn't vary, it's not like on the 16th moon or on, we haven't figured out how they know that the weather's about to change, the milkweed is about to die back, but this generation is born appropriately, able to come all the way back to that set of trees in Mexico, and they just cover those trees up. The video is really fascinating. But, so I think metamorphosis is an evidence for creation, not evolution. Evidence 5, rock strata. Touch on this one just because a lot of people think, oh, the rocks, these are old rocks. Almost those words go together in our mind, that we think of rocks as being old. I would like to make you rethink this. So here's some rock strata. Now when I look around me today, anywhere around Missouri, maybe with the exception of some parts of Nebraska, what I see is the ground that goes like this. You see uneven, what's called geomorphology. The geomorphology of the earth is not perfectly flat. There's hills, there's valleys, there's creeks, there's the wind erosion, there's water erosion, there's all the things that go on in nature that change the surface of the planet. What do we see here? Perfectly flat, straight lines. And we don't just see that for a mile or two or for a particular canyon. Some of these layers go on for thousands of miles. There are I think it's called the Tapeats limestone in the Grand Canyon, can be found in New York in a perfectly flat layer. And so it's not that everything's flat, but notice the surface isn't flat, it's kind of worn out and so forth. But if you look at these intersecting layers, one layer upon another. To me, this speaks of rapid deposition. How could something perfectly flat be covered by something perfectly flat and covered again by something perfectly flat? Millions of years don't give you that. Millions of years give you this kind of stuff. Yeah, you'll still have depositions, you'll still have volcanoes dumping ash, but you're not going to have perfectly flat, perfectly flat, perfectly flat, going on for literally in some places hundreds of miles without interruption. You can drive down to Cape Girardeau and just look at the cutouts alongside the road. Why are they so flat? Is that millions of years of deposition, or is that relatively rapid deposition that then hardened in place? I think the rock strata point to a story that doesn't support the millions of years. Charles Lyell, a geologist in the early 19th century, he basically coined a term called uniformitarianism, which is the notion that the things that we see operating in today's world are responsible for all the things that we see in the natural history of the Earth. And so using those assumptions, he's tried to explain the natural history of the Earth and the rock layers and so forth through uniformitarian gradual processes. Even geologists are coming around. They're introducing a new concept called catastrophe, not that new now, but catastrophism, where actually many of the things they see in the geologic record are evidence of catastrophes. Huge floods, dams that broke, washed out canyons, and so forth. So how about those colors, too? Look at how do we get all these colors? Didn't have millions of years to get no. This is actually after Mount St. Helens. Different. I got this from the Boston Globe, I think it was. Just different chemical compositions in these ponds. This is just an aerial photo after Mount St. Helens of four solid different colors. And now if those become part of the sedimentary layers that, maybe they soak the volcanic ash, which is basalt, and you actually have to get into a fair amount of earth science to explain all of this, but there are some pretty solid geologists now in the creationist camp. It's Michael Ord, O-A-R-D, if you're interested in more technical reading, and certainly Andrew Snelling. Anyway, the colors are there. Here's another aspect of rock strata. Tightly folded strata. This is a fold, not rocks. I don't know if you've noticed this. Try to bend a rock sometime. They don't bend, they just break. They crumble and break. And it's not that there isn't any, the evolutionists, when they see this, well, there's fissures in those rocks. Yeah, there are. It's old rock, and it is going to fissure, and it's going to have cracks in it. But that kind of a fold, to me, indicates that that was probably still soft when it folded. Well, we're talking several feet of sedimentation here before that was folded. Is that millions of years? It took millions of years to layer that down, and then how did that fold if it was a million-year process that got it to being 10 feet thick? I actually have a slide I don't have in this one. It shows this little thing sticking up from some rock, and it's each half inch. It took a million years of deposition. Then how did that thing last? It's like a fossil tree. That fossil tree is sitting there, sticking out of this depth of the sedimentary rock. And so I'm supposed to believe that fossil tree sat there for like 6 million years while the sedimentation built up around it. Two stories, and I think the creationists have a good story. This is granite. This is tightly folded granite near a mountaintop. Again, I think that rock implies rapid deposition. This is down, I forget where this is. This is from Buckman University. And these folds are not rare. And again, I think folded rock points to supports the creationist story. That would be, where did these deposition layers come from? Well, we have billions of dead things, as Ken Ham, I'll paraphrase Ken Ham. We have billions of dead things in sedimentary rock laid down by water all over the planet. Gee, what could do something like that? And kill all these things and bury them in sedimentary layers of rock? Well, the answer is the flood, recorded in Genesis. And that's a good, we'll get to the fossils here in a second, briefly. But these things to me speak to, for the young earth side of the camp and the creationist side. Okay, let's move on to number 6. Keep making tracks. Bats. Kind of creepy, but fascinating. One of the best represented mammals in the fossil record. In fact, I think they are the best, hands down. I believe there's over 20,000 bat fossils, which is a lot for any single species or any type of creature, any kind, if you will. Bats belong to the mammalian order Chiroptera, which is comprised of 2 suborders. The Microchiroptera, the little ones, And the Megachiroptera, the big one. See, scientists have to have their big words, but really that's the two classes of bats. You got your little bats and your big bats, but there's more to it. I'm having a little fun. The megabats, comprising larger bats, including the flying foxes or fruit bats. Okay, now when you start to look at the evolutionary story behind bats, you get the typical just-so stories. This is how did the elephant get a long trunk? Those kinds of stories. I get that evolutionists, this is not an evolutionist, this is but it might as well be. They can tell a story. That doesn't mean there's any real evidence for it. Well, evolution falls down so many places. Horse evolution, they just discarded. They gave up on the horse evolution, Neohippus and all that. But in the case of bats, you'll typically get this story, just like Darwin postulated with the eye. The eye made him shudder to think, how could such a complex system come about through natural processes? Well, he imagined this light-sensitive spot, and then as that got better and better through natural selection, choosing the more sensitive spots over the less sensitive spots, eventually you get to the eyeball. And it's that jump through from there to there that is the problem. Throw in a few million years, and you've got working eyeballs like humans and eagles have. Well, they'll do this with the bat. They'll do this with bats. They have a thing called echolocation. You know, squeak, squeak, they can hear. The bats are so sensitive and so good at this, they can detect a mosquito in the air through their echolocation system. But that's actually not where I go with bats, because they're actually prepared to talk about like gradual improvement, and any is better than none, and more is better than less, and so forth. But here's what I want you to think about. The bat, don't they look weird? Have you ever seen a bat on the ground? They just are so awkward and weird. Why is that? Anatomically, basically, the pelvis of the bat is reversed 180 degrees. Take it halfway around. Now, how did that evolve? What step-by-step process gets you from some sort of rodent, a rat or a squirrel or whatever, to a bat? 180 degrees change. How many things have to change to allow your digestive system is going to be affected, the muscular system, the interconnecting tissues, and all of this has to have selective advantage, right? Natural selection would choose for the advantage of this creature that's now shifting its pelvis 180 degrees over how many generations? Time doesn't explain this. The 20,000 or so bats that are in the fossil record, all of them look like that. There's no half bats, there's no quarter bats, no three-quarter bats. There's no animal in transition where the pelvis is almost there. No. It's reversed. It's reversed. And why? You see bats hang from the tree. I mean, they have a different life cycle and a different lifestyle. God created bats, that's why. If that sounds anti-science, it's really not. There's plenty we can learn and explore and study about bats. And this is what the founders of major science, whether it's Johann Kepler or Isaac Newton or Maxwell, these guys were exploring God's creation. There's plenty to do in science without trying to tell a story about how this thing got to be the way it is through some undirected, natural, materialistic process. That's why I like bats. By the way, you hear a lot about all the teeth. You know, evolutionists look at teeth and they'll say, this implies, you know, this was a meat eater, or this was a... The reason they know some dinosaurs were meat eaters is because we have fossils with undigested food in their stomach. First of all, how much water does it take to bury a complete dinosaur? Think about that. Then think about how much water does it take to bury hundreds of dinosaurs together in one location? Because that's what we really find. We find these fossil graveyards with hundreds of large animals in it. And so, but in some cases, they're in the process of giving birth. There's a plesiosaur with a half-born baby plesiosaur. There is all kinds of various stages. There's a fish half eating another fish. This happened rapidly. This wasn't some gradual process. If you die, or a squirrel dies in your yard, it's going to rot. Bacteria, other things are going to take care of that squirrel. It's not going to become a fossil. How do you become a fossil? Rapid burial. Isolation from the forces that would normally decay and break down the bones and everything about that. We have soft tissue fossils. We have jellyfish fossils. How do you get jellyfish fossils? Well, rapid burial. The only way to preserve these soft tissues is by preserving them from the forces that would break them down very quickly and rapidly. Okay, back to teeth. So here's the quiz question. A through F. Students love quizzes. So there's the type of insects or type of food that we'll associate with these teeth patterns. It's going to be easy, right? We can tell which one is the meat-eating bat, right, or the blood-sucking bat. And we can probably tell which one is the fruit. They know we can't. Not the layman, the scientist could, who studies these things. The point is, some fruit, like coconuts, has a very hard shell, and so you need some pretty serious teeth to break through a coconut, and so forth. Let's look at the answers here. A is insects. Everybody knew that, right? B is small mammals. C is fish. D is this is the vampire bat. Yeah, there are such things. They suck on they usually lay on cows and things, grazing animals, and suck blood until they get noticed. They're like really, really, really big mosquitoes. E is fruit. F is nectar and pollen. I'm just saying you can't draw too big of a conclusion from the just so story that is told in your evolutionary textbook. Okay, moving on. Oh, by the way, in terms of fossilization, doesn't it take millions of years to make a fossil? No. This is actually just caught on a stalagmite or a speleotherm, and the bat was fossilized in a matter of a few years. They find miners, bats, fossilized from mines that were dug, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. So no, it doesn't take millions of years either. But I'm jumping ahead on fossils. Evidence 7, radiochemistry. This one I really used to like to do, and well, I don't know. I think it's going to be a little much. So we'll speed through a few things. I just want to get a couple basic ideas. Atoms. You've heard the word atoms. You've heard the word molecules, I hope. And you don't need to remember all that chemistry stuff to follow some of this. I think this world also points to the handiwork of God in spades, many times over. And we'll just touch on just a recent finding. They now, electrons are so perfectly round that they're amazed by this. And it actually defies naturalistic explanations for the origin of electrons through the whole formation of everything from the Big Bang. But these electrons are so perfectly round that if the electron was the size of the Earth, the smallest bump on that surface would be smaller than the height of one molecule at the North Pole. These things are, that ain't if the Earth was truly round. These things are remarkable. Electrons are remarkable. They also spin, they orbit the nucleus of the atom in these shells. And quantum physics, which is another amazing world that I don't understand. I like reading about it, but it's way out there for me. There's these shells, the electrons, when they change between shells, there's no in between space. They disappear and then they appear in the other shell. All kinds of little things in quantum physics. Anyway, all we need to remember for the moment is that atoms are made up of protons and neutrons and electrons that go around them. By the way, these electrons spin. Keep that in mind. I'll bring that back up later. You may have seen the periodic table. We're not going to do much with this. It just lists all the atoms, all the naturally occurring atoms, at least at the beginning. And then as you get into these higher things, some of these we've only created in like the Hadron Collider, in these various physics experiments. They might exist for a fraction of a microsecond, but they create them and they add to the table. But all these lower ones are the more stable ones. Names you've heard: carbon, oxygen, gold, lead, things like that. Okay, so radioactive decay. Some of these isotopes. Isotope is basically an atom that has a configuration of protons and neutrons with electrons going around it. But that configuration actually varies a little bit, and so they call them isotopes. For carbon, the basic carbon is called carbon-12. And you may hear that term, carbon-12, carbon-12. Okay, fine, and that's really it's a rounded off atomic mass. It's a number that tells us what carbon is, carbon-12. But there's two other primary major isotopes for carbon. There's carbon-13 and carbon-14. Carbon-14 is pretty radioactive. Right now, we're breathing air. Right now, the air around us has oxygen, it has nitrogen, and it has carbon dioxide in it. Right now, the carbon that is in the carbon of our atmosphere right now is about one carbon-14 atom to every trillion carbon-12 atoms. That's roughly the ratio in naturally occurring carbon at the surface of the planet. Up in space, you get more carbon-14. In fact, it's generated up there. Not outside. I'll go that later. Anyway, so some of these isotopes decay. Carbon-14 is decaying. Most of the things are decaying to like the simpler, more stable form. Carbon-14 doesn't decay into carbon-12, actually decays into nitrogen. but it's decaying. That's carbon-14 is radioactive. By decaying, things, in this case, and I'm actually not using carbon because this is an example of what we call alpha decay. Alpha decay, you lose something. Beta decay, things just change. Carbon-14 is dating is based on beta decay. But the classic radiometric dating techniques that use things like uranium, lead, potassium, argon, and rubidium, strontium, and all these different elements, they're basically saying, hey, this element is decaying, it's radioactive, it's decaying, and over some half-life, it's going to decay into this other element, rubidium into strontium, uranium-237 into lead, well, this is 238 into thorium-234, but there's a 237 uranium that's decaying into lead-207 or something. Anyway, that decay gives off something. It gives off helium. Helium, that second one on the periodic table, very slippery atom. Helium is interesting properties. And if you, so how do they do radioactive dating? They, first of all, what can you date? You can date igneous rock, you can date metamorphic rock, or you can date things that were alive and once dead. For igneous, that were once alive, but now. You can date yourself, but guess what? You're modern. Carbon dating is used for all living things. Any carbon creatures, carbon-based life forms, are subject to carbon dating because they have carbon. So you got carbon-14 decaying into something and leaving, the ratio changes over time. The ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12. Same with these. This is for rocks. When you're dating rocks, you use one of these non- or inorganic methods, and you count the ratio, and you say, okay, we think this thing is this old. There's so many assumptions built in there. Like, what was the starting ratio? Do you know that? No, you weren't there a billion years ago if you accept their things. Do you accept that the rate never changed? How could you know that? Imagine it this way. You walk into a room and there's a glass of ice water, but there's barely any ice left. How long has that ice water been sitting there? How long did it take the ice to melt to that state? Or maybe it just started 5 minutes ago, came out from the kitchen and got set there and it looked exactly like that. Or so, and how many factors influence what you're seeing now? The rate that the ice is melting and turning into the water, the room temperature, did the room temperature stay constant the entire time, or was the ice water out in the sun before it was brought in? All these factors influence the ratio of ice to water. In the same way, there's all kinds of assumed factors that influence the ratio of the isotopes to one another when they're doing radiometric dating. This is, a lawyer would do the same thing. Well, Judge, you know, reasonable doubt enters in here because you're talking about assumptions of what the ratios are and what they have always been. And remember, as I said last week, time is as much of an enemy as it is a friend. Time creates problems. So you're saying, and we have no way of knowing this, that over the last 1.5 billion years, the half-life of uranium-237 has not altered at all? What about when the Earth's a little closer to the sun or a little further from the sun? What about when the magnetic field was much stronger on the Earth? What about when cosmic radiation or sunspots? Does nothing influence half-life? We don't know. We think it's pretty solid in terms of half-life. That's probably not the best place to play against the assumption, but there's many assumptions that's just part of it. Okay. So anyway, I just mentioned, kind of describe carbon in its breakdown. This is the main ones that are used for minerals, not what we call inorganic. Organic is the molecules of life, organic carbon-based life forms. And that's clearly distinct. There's even a separate branch of chemistry, organic chemistry, from all the other chemistry that has to just do with chemicals and non-living things. This is for non-living things. This is your basic thorium, lead, rubidium, strontium, and all that stuff. And then carbon-14, and it's, note the half-life differences. 4.5 billion years. These are huge half-lives that influence what kind of accuracy you're going to get with the number. Carbon, 5,730 years. Libby had it, the guy who figured this all out and got the Nobel Prize for it. He had it at 5,700 years. We refined his numbers, about 5,730. That's fine. It's good science in terms of, just imagine if it starts at 1 trillion to 1. Then in 5,730, you're going to have 2 trillion to 1. And in 10,000 and added up 11,460, you're going to have 4 trillion to 1. So the ratio and then the degree of instrumentation that it takes to detect that ratio, pretty amazing science going on here. So, but for that reason, you can't get out 100,000 years. That ratio is just too big for even our best equipment to count the number of carbon-14 isotopes relative to the number of carbon-12 isotopes. So we For that reason, anybody who says carbon dating proves dinosaurs, no. Carbon dating has no purpose outside of about 100,000 years at the biggest. I got to sit on a panel with a carbon dating guy who's written books on it, and he's an evolutionist. Well, actually, he's a theistic creationist, so he's old Earth and all that. And we got into a nice side conversation, but he would go to 40,000 years, no more. You can't take carbon dating beyond 40,000 years. So anytime you hear dinosaurs in the same sense as carbon dating, you're being bamboozled. No atheist materialistic scientist even believes that knows what carbon dating is. It's useful only for the last 10, 40, 50,000 years, depending on who you talk to. Okay, so for the highlights, the difference are organic only for carbon dating. The non-carbon, that's where you get your billions of years. Okay, so let's date this fossil. Well, wait a second. The fossil is buried in sedimentary rock. By definition, it was laid down in water and it was encased and fixed there. Not in igneous rock, not in metamorphic rock. You can't date sedimentary rock. Why is that? This is a mixture of sediments. You're going to get different dates if you date this little piece, that little piece. There's little specks of everything in there. You can't date sedimentary rock. You can date metamorphic rock. You can date igneous rock. Okay, but if you want to date those, then you find like a fissure that is near the fossil you found, and you say, well, they're about the same level, must be about the same age. You make some assumptions. Okay, so inorganic material, short half-life on carbon, long half-life on that stuff, maximum dates, a little vary depending on who you read, and then billions of years on the other. Okay, so what? Well, remember I mentioned helium as a byproduct of all of that alpha decay, which is what the inorganic dating methods are measuring. The ratio of isotopes changing they're changing and they're giving off helium. Tons and tons of helium. If this rock has been here a billion years, how much helium would have been released as it decayed from rubidium to strontium or from any of those? Those are all alpha decay technique methods that are employed as we look at that decay. And the answer is we have way too much helium in rocks, because helium is a very slippery molecule, and way too little helium in the atmosphere. What we find in nature today doesn't match the story of this rock's a billion years old and it's been decaying. And now when I say rock, imagine something on the order of the Grand Canyon-sized rocks. When we look at those, we find way too much helium in those rocks. Helium is a very slippery molecule. It escapes easily. A very slippery atom, rather. But in the atmosphere, we don't have as much helium as we should have if this Earth, all the layers of granite and other igneous and metamorphic rock on this Earth has been decaying for all this time. We should have a whole lot more helium in the atmosphere, and we really shouldn't find that much helium in those rocks. Time is the enemy. Time gives helium a chance to slip away. But what do we find? Tons of helium in the rocks, very little helium in the atmosphere. There's charts and things, and there's rescuing devices. Okay, we don't understand the rate at which helium is escaping the atmosphere, therefore it's not enough because it's escaping too fast. I mean, there's counter arguments to all this stuff, and we don't have time to go through those, but my point is we shouldn't find it. Okay, remember radiocarbon dates for short dates? Why do we find it in diamonds? Why do we find why do we find carbon-14 in coal? I thought coal took millions of years to form, all that layer pressing, millions. How could we find carbon-14, which should all be gone after 100,000 years using the best instrument we can even imagine? And yet we find carbon-14 in coal, we find carbon-14 in diamonds, we find it in this stuff that's supposed to be old. This is the reason I actually even keep including this, is because radiometric dating sounds good. Oh, this rock's 500 million years old. The dinosaurs died out 67 million years ago because of this and that. We dated this particular meteorite. The Earth is 4.54 billion years old because of the dates we got from this meteorite. All of the assumptions built in are one thing, but there's a lot of other factors that make this story a little weak, in my opinion, especially when it comes to carbon. What about those dinosaur soft tissues? We date those. They're essentially modern. I have a whole separate talk on dinosaurs. How about amber? Well, amber creates a number of interesting issues. We keep finding things in amber that shouldn't be there. We find amber inside coal seams that have creatures that never should have even been there yet. Types of insects that we think came along 100 million years ago, we're finding them in 500 million year old coal using their dating methods. So, age of the Earth is throwing problems for many reasons. This is where it was in the Carboniferous coal, it refers to the layers. You know, dated at 320 million years old within the uniformitarian timescale, such a date is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, for amber. What's amber come from? Trees, tree sap. They shouldn't have been there. They weren't there yet. Trees hadn't evolved yet, and yet we're finding amber inside these coal seams. Something is wrong. Something is off. However, the most remarkable aspect of the newly discovered carboniferous amber is that it has a molecular composition that has been seen only from angiosperms, which came even later than just the general things that evolved in their story, which appeared much later in the early Cretaceous. So these problems don't make it to the top. They don't make it to the front page on the evolutionary papers, but they're there, and oftentimes they're buried. In any case, this 320 million year old amber is certainly not from angiosperms, which arose almost 200 million years later. So the timing is way off. This happens to be from a creation site. They tend to make this stuff a little more readable. Okay, gotta keep moving. Evidence 8, origin of life. Actually, this is my favorite topic now, relative to creation and evolution. And we don't have time to do it any justice. So, if you have a science background, I totally recommend this book from Changed Hands. She was recently fired from the University of Missouri, Columbia, probably for writing this book. She didn't have tenure. Found out there was creationists on the staff. She was doing good. She was teaching and she was doing her thing, but then they fired her. Anyway, it's a great book. I found it the perfect intersection for my level of science, which isn't that great, with an explanations that do make sense. And so here's the 12, there's like 15, 16 chapters, but here are just some of the steps. They're not necessarily even in order, but that you would need, and we won't go through all these, we're just going to touch on this. Formation and concentration of building blocks. We have not even been able to synthesize ribose. Ribose, you've heard of DNA? Deoxyribonucleic acid, or RNA, ribonucleic acid. That's got ribose. And you can find a paper on the web today that says we've synthesized ribose. It's right out there. Well, look at the ribose they've synthesized. They don't get into this. Ribose that is used in all of life has a 5-sided, it's called a penta-something structure, of carbon ring. The only ribose we've been able to synthesize has 6 sides, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work for the purpose of then turning it into DNA. But what they'll do, they'll synthesize something close, then they buy ingredients from the lab and start do the next step and act like they're creating this step-by-step unfolding of chemistry that would lead to life. No. They never use the product of the earlier step as they move to the next step, except in very specific cases. This gets really technical, but the point is, imagine you had a recipe that called for 3 drops of red paint. Okay, and you had an earlier thing that said, okay, we can generate red paint, but only when we generate light along with it, all the other colors. So basically we end up with a bucket with all the colors mixed in. And we say, see, we generated red paint. It's in the bucket. It's hard to see, but it's in there. We had a really great instrument. We might even be able to extract just the red paint molecules from all the other molecules if we had really good laboratory instruments. And they're doing some great stuff in the labs now. The next step requires 3 drops of red paint. You say, well, we got red paint. See, this is just evolution. We've got the red paint. Well, then the pushback is how, and it's called prebiotic conditions. First of all, you don't have any enzymes or any of the machinery of the cell to get the red paint out. All you've got is prebiotic, which is there is no cell, there's nothing alive. We're talking about the origin of life. There's nothing alive. Therefore, how do you get 3 drops of red paint from that? Well, they kind of skim over that and just start with 3 drops of red paint for the next section of the paper. Or there's another paper, actually. Each one gets its own paper. Anyway, the formation and concentration of building blocks is a huge leap. We have, like the Urey-Miller experiments from the 50s, they were able to create a couple of basic amino acids, which are one of the building blocks of proteins, unusable. And they only were able to preserve them by separating them very quickly from the rest of the stuff they were creating. The formation and concentration of building blocks is a huge thing. She's only got about 5 pages on it, so you don't get to be buried. It's not that thick of a book. The homochirality of building blocks. These have to be anomers. Okay, I brought my handy props. Probably have trouble seeing this in the background. Sorry. Legos, okay? Now imagine this idea of chirality means they're mirror images of one another. Who would say these are mirror images of one another? Yeah, they are. When you put this in a mirror, it's going to look like that, right? They're mirror images. Note they're not superimposable mirror images. These are non-superimposable mirror images. That's called an enantiomer, for whatever reason. So that means there's no way for me to manipulate this one to make them superimpose exactly on the, it can't be done. They're non-superimposable mirror images. That's the definition of an enantiomer, or in the broader term, chirality. Now, on the other hand, this one looks like this. Did I do that right? Probably did it wrong. I do it backwards unless I'm, let's see, I want to try to get this right. Yeah, these don't look like mirror images, but they're superimposable. They're exactly superimposable on the other. This is kind of the idea of chirality. Non-superimposable mirror images are enantiomers, and that's what the chiral forms are of all of life. There's a left-handed and a right-handed. Chiral means hand, left-handed, right-hand side. Your hands are non-superimposable mirror images of each other. In other words, that's why you can't just put on a left glove and it works. Or a right glove. No, you got to put the left glove on the left hand, right hand. That's important. Okay. So this homochirality of building blocks is important for all kinds of reasons. If you get a mixture, it doesn't work. So here's how original life science works. They put all the Legos in a huge trash bag, they shake it, they put pressures on it, they do all this stuff, and guess what? When they start to open the bag, they find these. They look, we've got a left-handed form, certain type of amino acid, there it is. Now what they don't say is we've got 1 trillion other Legos in there that are all the wrong kind. That's called yield. The yield very often is less than 1% of what they have to have. Now here's the point. This then has to chain. There's what are called peptides. They're going to extend, they're going to chain these things together. And millions of problems here. In fact, it may be its own consistent linkage of building blocks. You start to chain these things together. Well, you've got this inside of a bag of 1 million, and you can only chain it with other exact chiral image molecules of the same type. And yet all these molecules have the ability to, all in quotes, they have the ability to connect with each other in a variety of ways. I saw a paper. 6 sugars have the ability to connect with each other in over 1 trillion ways. Just 6 sugar molecules, glucose molecules. Over 1 trillion ways to connect them. There's only one way that works for life. Do you think there's a hurdle here that evolution has to get through? There's no bigger hurdles than we see in the origin of life. It's fun because God is his handiwork at the molecular level. We're marveling about James Webb right now and the stuff it's finding in the universe. We can marvel going down too, looking at what we're seeing just as part of the biological world we belong to. Anyway, these are all great topics. Probably my favorite chapter is means of harnessing energy. Every mitochondria, which is an organelle inside of every cell. Next time I see a tree, I've looked this now, I don't know. Every leaf on that tree is made up of cells. Every cell of that leaf of that tree has these little organelles in it. These organelles are little machines doing remarkable things. If you need evidence for God, there's probably millions of them on that tree outside your door. Because every one of those cells is doing all, their cellular life, which it would be its own, it's got its own talk, it's called the wonder of the cell. It's just remarkable for a number of reasons. Your mitochondria use what's called a proton pump. We can use electric motors. We're manipulating electrons to create energy. Your mitochondria uses proton pumps, uses proton motors. How does it do that? Well, there's a 15-step process to split the proton off from the molecules that was brought to it, food that you have. That 15-step process, the distance between these steps is so precise, it's like 10 to 12 angstroms. Angstrom is about the width of a hydrogen atom. You've got a 15-step process. If you spread that out by 1 angstrom, it reduces its speed by 100-fold. It's like instead of going 1,000 miles an hour in your car and things are working, you're now going 10 miles an hour in your car. 100-fold decrease. If you change it even a little more than that, it doesn't work at all. The whole chain breaks down. So just getting the protons that feed the proton motor, it's amazing. All of this is amazing, but we'll go on. And I was going to put this in right. There's different cellular machinery. This is the one I spent too much time last night trying to figure out how to show ATP synthase. This is one of the another remarkable molecular machine inside of every cell of your body, and but it's 4 minutes long, so we're done. Okay, now I'll get out of here in 2 minutes. DNA in ancient bacteria. Well, it shouldn't be there. This bacteria is too old to have the DNA that we see. But really the problem is it looks just like modern DNA. How can it, it's a billion years old, it looks like modern bacterial DNA. Bacteria have their own story in the genetic world. It is not now that even a single bacteria doesn't include its entire genome. All the genome of bacteria is not within a single bacteria. It's in the colony. Bacteria has all these mechanisms that allow it to manipulate its genetic data. They're called horizontal gene transfer, HRT, and these plasmids, and all this other machinery comes into the works to allow bacteria to do what it does, which is change. So it helps break down stuff that's on our planet. We've now got bacteria we created in the lab that will decompose nylon. That was a big deal. The evolutionists said, see, they've all the ability to decompose nylon. No, bacteria is being bacteria. That's what it does. And it's hard to compare anything in the bacterial world to the rest of the world. It's a prokaryote versus eukaryotes and all. We forget all that. Anyway, we're going to move on, because my time's up, to fossils. And this is, again, I'll just do the highlights here, because we've got about a minute. Sudden appearance. We don't find half-formed things. Stasis, you find anything. I got this from Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldridge, two big-time evolutionists, originators of punctuated equilibrium theory, popular in the early 80s. He used to read, Gould's a brilliant communicator, atheist, Marxist, evolutionist, but a great communicator. Anyway, his big point was stasis. Things enter the fossil record and don't change for 70 million years. The same. Shark, the same. Turtle, the same. I mean, it's really amazing. Polystrate fossils. I mentioned that we have fossil trees that extend through multiple layers of sedimentary rock. Okay, well, if it took millions of years, you really want to do that tree stood there for that long? They're called polystrate fossils. They stick through several strata. Out-of-order fossils. Mostly simple things are near the bottom. More complex things are near the top. You'll see that in the Grand Canyon. Oh, there you go. Isn't that gradual unfolding of evolution? Yeah, or maybe it's just the speed at which they could escape from rising floodwaters. The more higher mammals are going to be able to get away from rising water a little better than a turtle or than some of the reptiles and so forth. So there's all kinds of issues with the order of fossils, but if I was an evolutionist, that's where I would try to argue your strongest case. Living fossils. Yeah, we find things that should have been dead 100 million years. The coelacanth is the most common example, but there's many. And the placement of fossils, they're just not where they should be in many things. And the quantity. Very few human fossils. If humans have been on the Earth for even 100,000 years, we should have a lot more human in the fossil record. We don't. I forgot to change the colors on this one. No, that's probably just as well. Here's the fossil. Here's the modern one. You can't tell the difference. They give them different scientific names to make you think, oh, it's a million years old, it must be different. Maybe not a million years old. This is a dragonfly. This is the ancient fossil. This is the modern dragonfly. We find this a lot. This is in the lower order life forms. What we call that, because lower order even is a little bit term. Grasshopper and lobster. We find those in the fossil record. We find all kinds of things. Crickets. Now, again, these will all get different scientific names. Why? They don't differ as much as dogs do. They have all canis from the Harris. They don't differ as much as a Chihuahua to a Dachshund to a Great Dane, but they'll get different scientific names. Anyway, we'll stop here. I appreciate it. Sorry I didn't leave time for questions, and I appreciate your attendance and all that good stuff and the gifts. That was very nice. And,